I'm Kevin Crowder. I'm the founder of BusinessFlare, Street Economics, the host of the Music Cities podcast. Today I'm here. I want to tell you a little bit about our one of our products here at Street Economics called ECOSINT. What is ECOSINT? It's economic open source intelligence. And why is this important? It's another sort of evolution, I guess, of BusinessFlare and our approach. And we're going to call this story how two 22-year-old soldiers could have saved the Panama Canal and maybe the world. So, at BusinessFlare, we do a lot of economic analysis, but it's about how we wrap that in stories, and how do we find those insights and make it meaningful for communities. So, a few months ago, I was at SelfWorks, the Special Operations Forces, the Innovation Accelerator Center over in Tampa that helps support the Special Operations Command with new innovations, new products. Entrepreneurs come through, try and solve problems that special ops are having. And at the same time, listening to people like Sarah Adams and Scott Mann, Legend, Sean Ryan, listening to a lot of their analysis based now on open source intelligence, not things that are classified, but just their own efforts in digging and finding in the public record, in the public domain, in open sources, in the news, in different places, finding information that they can then use to connect the dots following terrorist plans, threat assessments, especially threat assessments that have to do with just our neighborhoods and our local cities, stuff that's meaningful on the ground. It's very similar to economic development. We have national security that's way up here dealing with strategic issues and international affairs and all of that. But then you have the national security threats that actually happen in your backyard, most of which we're missing. We have the same thing in economic development. You can have all these wins here in Miami. Yay, we got the Citadel relocated their headquarters here. West Palm Beach, yay, we've got all these hedge funds coming, and we've got these manufacturers and these big companies coming that we celebrate on a regional basis. Well, what does that do for our neighborhoods where people have to actually live? That's where we spend our time working economic development, is on the ground in these real places that are often ignored. So as I'm listening to that word OSINT, open source intelligence, I'm thinking back to my time in the Army. And in that time, I worked in military intelligence, signals intelligence, eavesdropping, basically. And I spent most of my time doing that at a place, Goleta Island in Panama, and lived on Fort Davis in Panama. And I can remember one thing about the learning about open source intelligence is, besides the classified stuff that we would do that I won't get into here, in the mornings there'd be a briefing book, and it'd be all of these reports from around the world, from different news outlets and different sources, and it essentially was open source intelligence. It's stuff that's out there in the open, but you as a layperson, just when you read the headlines, you don't see the intelligence value of the information that's in there. And you don't make those connections because you don't have access to the other information. You're not thinking that way. It's not classified until it's acknowledged that it's classified, if it's out there in the public domain. And we'd get just all these interesting reports that we would read. And I remember it was really cool getting all those reports just on a minute by minute basis, it seemed like, during the coup, or the attempted coup against Gorbachev, when they took him to the Crimea to supposedly arrest and relaxation and then house arrest. But watching that entire revolution in the Soviet Union and Russia happen, and reading it through all these open source sources and reports, that just made it different than reading it on the news and seeing it on the news, because here it's got that open source intelligence framework where these dots are being connected. You're seeing this in real time as that happened. And then I started thinking about how open source economic information could be used from an intelligence analysis perspective? And how could it be relevant, say, to special operations forces, to base adjacent cities, to military installations, and understand the economic vulnerabilities or opportunities? So understand, what is the economic intelligence that, say, special operations forces would need now that they have apparently been empowered to go after the Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations? Well, what are all of that economic intelligence that you need to understand about the cartels in order to do that? What do you need to understand around military bases? What do you need around Camp Humphreys in Korea? What's the economic intelligence that you need just for base security and understanding things like supply chain, workforce, things that even housing and things that are relevant to the health and morale of your members and their families, as well as the economic influences on you and your operations in a military facility. And then third, for a community, say like Homestead, Florida, or any of the base adjacent communities around the country that are next to an active or a reserve base, what do you need to know? What do you need to understand about your economic security, your economic environment that's meaningful and relevant to you from a sort of a national security perspective, and look at the economic data? Again, some of it is supply chains. It can be housing. It can be quality of life for families. It can be understanding, as we've seen in Florida and some other states, what's happening with real estate purchases and straw buyers and things with where there's China or other foreign governments trying to acquire property near military installations. So all of this just created this idea in my head: economic open source intelligence, using military nomenclature, ECOSINT. That's how we call it. And so we're able to do that from that sort of intelligence reporting perspective, looking at the economy. And then we can do that not just through national security lens, but just in general in an evaluation of a community. It's a different way it's a different approach to take to economic analysis of a community, and including economic security, but you identify opportunities as well. And maybe it's a leaner, actionable approach. Think about intelligence. You have strategic intelligence and you have tactical intelligence. You have strategic intelligence that feeds, say, the National Security Agency, the CIA, the planners in DC, the diplomats, and they use this for big picture planning and negotiations and all of that. But then you have tactical intelligence. That was our battlefield intelligence. That was the unit I was at in Savannah, at Hunter Army Airfield, compared to in Panama, where I was with a strategic intelligence unit. Well, it's the same with economic development. We like the tactical economic development space, which is where you're actually implementing. You're doing the work. You're working with the redevelopment agencies and the entrepreneurs and the businesses and the people that need to be doing things day to day to meet the expectations that you have now. Local governments like to do economic development strategic plans and 3 and 5 year plans. Constituents and businesses and even a lot of politicians, they want to see things happen now. They don't want to wait 3 or 5 years. So that's what the ECOSINT report really is focused on. It's a tactical report. It's a battlefield, think about it, report for what can you do? What are your actionable insights for economic development? And we're doing this through Street Economics, which is our custom artificial intelligence platform built specifically for economic development, trained for economic development. You can watch a number of our comparison videos where we compare economic development outputs and recommendations between our Street Economics platform and generic, just the regular AI that's out there, whether it's ChatGPT, Gemini, Grok, or Claude, and see what a difference it makes when the AI is trained in a domain-specific way, like economic development. And then we're able even to come and add in proprietary data, not just rely on the open source. AI is open source artificial intelligence, but customize it. But we start off with different levels, and we have an AI version of an ECOSINT report that we run for places that we're interested in evaluating. We can run for communities at a price point that's much more affordable and reasonable than what you're going to get for maybe not even insights that are as good out of traditional consulting. Because remember, the AI can take and it can make all of those connections that you need to make between different data points to find either things that are meaningful, things that need to be considered, to build scenarios. And I was thinking about this, and the other thing that led me to think about this economic open source intelligence is the threat of China and the growing China threat over the past few years. We did a report not too long ago on China invading Taiwan, and what does that mean for local governments in Florida, for cities in Florida. And that was one of our first ECOSINT reports that we created, and it's available if you subscribe to our Patreon account, $20 a month. You get access to all of the ECOSINT reports that we run. But it reminded me of one of my stories from my time in Panama, and this would be in about 1991. And I was reminded of this over the past few months, starting with towards the end of the last presidential campaign, and then some different conversations and news that's been out there since then. And it has to do with the Panama Canal and the Chinese influence over the Panama Canal. And I was stationed in Panama. I left in late 1991. Never made it back there to be stationed there. I ended up getting out of the service, but where I was stationed was transitioned back to Panama, and those bases given away in 1995. And by 1999, the end of 1999, we were out. We had turned over all of the facilities. We had moved all the personnel back to the States, and Panama had full control of not only the canal, but the canal zone and all of the former U.S. bases. All part of the 1977 Panama Canal Treaty negotiated by President Carter and General Torrijos in Panama. I think, for me and a lot of people I know that were stationed down there, we think it was a mistake, but, the soldiers aren't the bosses. We just see what's going on. And, as John Shrek McVie, I saw recently say on Sean Ryan on something much more serious, but said, sometimes you believe in or you trust your bosses, and sometimes they get it wrong. Well, I think they got it wrong with the Panama Canal. But anyway, what happened was a buddy of mine and I decided that, we worked shift work. And so we ended up having 3, almost 4 days off at a time. And we decided we were just going to go spend the weekend in Panama City, just hanging out, hitting some of the bars and different places, because it had opened up, and the casinos and the bars were not under restriction anymore, which they had been for a while after the Just Cause invasion. But we had time and we could do it, so we decided we were going to go over there. We went over the first night we're at the Riande Continental Hotel, walked in right in the middle of a fashion show. It was great. But then we wanted to go to this other club, and it was what we understood was an upscale strip club. And it was called Le Palace. And I believe it's still there. It's down close to where a bunch of the embassies are in Panama City. Of course, we were stationed over close to Cologne on Fort Davis. So this was to go there. It was going to be a weekend in Panama City. So we go, and we go to this place, and it's really nice. I can still picture it. I can still picture the parking. We go inside. It's really nice. We get a table towards the front. Now you've got to put the time in perspective. It's 1991. We're American GIs. We're enlisted. We're E5s. Maybe I'm an E5 and maybe Dan's an E4. We don't make a lot of money. We make more than the average Panamanians. And, as it is in Panama, similar to, how it can be, say, in Korea, the females of the country are very friendly with us American soldiers. And even, most places we went, we had disposable income. Our room and board was taken care of. We didn't make a lot of money, but what we did make, we had to spend however we wanted it to. And so we were used to a certain reception when we go to different establishments, restaurants and stores and different places. So we go to this place, and I think as an E5, I probably made $1,700 a month, not a huge amount. So, an Atlas beer or Panama beer, you buy a six pack, it's like between $2 and $3. You go to a bunch of restaurants and the beer is not expensive. But in this place, we order our drinks, and what they had was Heineken. And in 1991, in Panama City, Panama, the Heinekens that they brought us were $12 each. It's like, whoa, we're, you know, we don't pay that much for beer. We don't make enough. That's a lot of money, and there's a 2 drink minimum. So $50 between the two of us in 91 for, call it broke soldiers. Soldiers that definitely didn't have a huge amount of money to spend, even though we did have some. Anyway, so we sit there and we nurse our beers. And it's curious because we realized that while they'd given us a good table, we realized there's no other Americans in this place, which was a little strange considering it was more upscale. It didn't seem to be. It seemed to be more for an international crowd, at least, not for the locals. But there's no other Americans in there, and the girls aren't really paying a lot of attention to us. And it turns out it's not exactly a strip club. It's like a ripoff of a Playboy club, and it's really burlesque. And so it's not raunchy, it's not raw. It's and they have this stage, and it's about an hour and a half of different burlesque skits that they come out and do. And but yeah, the waitresses they're dressed in the Playboy bunny outfit, even though it's not a Playboy club, it's a ripoff of one. And they'll check on us now and then, but they're not hanging out and chatting, which they're doing with a bunch of the other customers. And then it kind of hits us, and it's kind of curious that we're the only Americans in there, and everybody else in there is a Chinese businessman in 1991 in Panama. So this is really curious and really odd. And I can remember when we got back to Fort Davis and to our unit, I can remember, I'm going to use the word telling, a lot of people, including people in our chain, platoon sergeant, company, battalion commanders, about this experience and about this curiosity of all these Chinese businessmen being in there. But I'm not going to use the word we reported that, because that would imply that we had any clue that there was anything of significance to it. It was just really an oddity. It was a curiosity that they were there. It was as much curiosity that the girls weren't paying attention to two Americans as that there were a room full of Chinese businessmen. But it was weird because while there was a big Chinese community that we encountered in Panama City, it was more working. It was the Chinatown. It was the family and the generations running a Chinese restaurant and the merchants and more of that. It wasn't the sort of high finance business suits. It wasn't really the suits that we were expecting to see. So anyway, it was a curiosity that I forgot about by the time I got back to the States in 92. Was no reason to remember that story. There's plenty of other great stories from Panama that I had. Until, well, maybe first about 10 years ago, when I went down and saw all of this infrastructure work that had been done around Panama City, and was told that a lot of that was P3 money and a lot of that was funded and backed by Chinese money, and that the Chinese were there. And then I know some people, some expats and people who've retired down there, some of who I had served with down there, who've given me varying stories about how much or how little the Chinese influence is in Panama. Because you hear these big, you start hearing, well, they've taken over the canal and they own this and they own that. And then you ask some of the Americans that have moved down there, and they all have different opinions. You've got some who'll say not at all, and some who say, yeah, it's as bad as they say. I'm not here to give an opinion on that, but it rekindled that memory, at least, of seeing the Chinese businessmen and saying, okay, now it makes sense. They kind of knew that we were eventually going to vacate. 8 years later, though, this is 91. We gave up the canal at the end of 99. And then during the campaign, it became an issue. China controls the canal. China controls the ports at each end of the canal. And, and there's rhetoric and then there's reality. And I'm not going to get into which is which and where the final story is. But we've seen the reaction from Panama to this. We've seen some of the reaction of China to all of this happening. We've seen some shifting and attempts to make purchases of some of the infrastructure, some of the companies that do the infrastructure or run some of these ports. So you see enough movement to know that there's something there, and that and we all know about the Belt and Road Initiative that the Chinese have, and clearly they want to make inroads in Latin America because it's the relationship between the United States and China is very different now than it was in 1991 when this incident happened that I'm telling you about. And we all clearly know that China is our biggest threat and our biggest rival that we have. And so clearly they want to make as many inroads in our backyard as they can, just considering how many we have in their backyard. But it got me thinking also very recently about our ECOSINT report and the ability of AI to take seemingly meaningless information or insignificant or isolated information and events and weave those things together to come up with a scenario analysis. So the question was, could we have identified the potential threat that China represented to us in Panama in 1991 if we had the AI platforms that we have now? Could the AI have taken that incident and enough other of the information it has access to and given an early warning that then goes into military affairs and diplomacy and all of that to say, in 35 years, this is going to be a big, big issue, and you need to do what you can between now and then to mitigate it and not let them grab a foothold or that much influence. And I think about this because I remember reading an article, and I'm going to try and find it, in probably about 2000. It was right after the final handover back to Panama. And I can remember it might have been the last commanding general of U.S. Southern Command when it was down there that said this. But what I remember is that there had been a meeting with the government of Panama. And I don't remember if the meeting was with the president or the president's envoy or somebody from Panama. And the question to the general was, well, maybe can we talk about the U.S. staying longer? Because we had a big economic impact in Panama. 25,000 soldiers, a lot of the time with their dependents down there, spend, disposable income and money to spend. It's a big economic impact. And I remember that the answer that the general said he gave when they asked maybe we could talk about the U.S. staying was he said, we're already gone. There was maybe 200 people left in country. Remember, the drawdown did not happen on December 31st of 1999. Fort Davis, Galita Island, where I had been stationed and worked, that was handed over in 1995. So by 99, there's nobody left in country. Very few, most of the installations had already been turned over. So there's no ability. I mean, there's always an ability, but there's really no ability or interest at that point to stay. But what it got me thinking was, if you had AI and you had AI trained to do open source intelligence, economic open source intelligence specifically, because our, call it Cold War with China is an economic war. It's not a military war. It's not a diplomatic. I mean, it's a diplomatic war, but it's not an arms race to the point that the one with the Soviet Union was. It's very much still economic. If we had plugged in that observation, could we have identified a scenario and a series of options where when that question came 8 years later to the general, maybe we should, talk about the U.S. staying, that there's a different sort of assessment? Or during those 8 years, all of a sudden there's a different assessment and way to look. Because I just don't think there was a reason from an intelligence collection perspective to be concerned about China when we were down there in 1991. It was very much about communist insurgencies in places like Peru, Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Sandinistas in Nicaragua, um, and the narcos, Medellin, Cali cartels, and such. And could AI have flagged a different potential threat and done prediction long term? So what we're going to do is we're going to come back in part two, and we're going to build and train and prompt our street economics AI model to take this question on and see what it can come up with. And then we want to use that and show you how finding these seemingly irrelevant, insignificant things in your community might help you scenario role play different situations and identify ways that you, for your local economy, can identify and make the best policy decisions that you can. So, thanks for listening to my long, rambling story. We'll see you in part two. Let's do it.